All right. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Huynh. He's an associate professor here of psychology at Texas A&M San Antonio. He received his Bachelor of Science in Psychology at the University of Arizona in 2008 and his PhD in social/health psychology at the University of California, Riverside in 2014. Dr. Huynh conducts research in the areas of social and health psychology. He studies how people get the best out of each other, especially when one party holds more power than the other. He teaches courses related to the areas of expertise and research methods and statistics. And in his free time, he enjoys coaching volleyball with the Alamo VBA. It is with great pleasure that I let everyone listen to the wonderful stylings of Dr. Ho Huynh in his talk, Health and Humility.
The wonderful stylings. I love it. All right. So I see that many of you guys have, actually all of you guys elected to turn off your video. Certainly you don't have to. You can turn it on so I can look at you, or you can keep it off. That's fine with me too. So the talk I'm giving today is on humility and health. It looks like a third of you guys are third years, about 36% of you guys are seniors, and few of you guys are in your first or second year, which is exciting. So most of you guys have been around, or maybe have transferred in as juniors. By the way, as we're going, anytime you want to drop a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. And if I don't get to it, maybe if some of you guys can unmute your mic and say, hey, just check the box, that would be good too. So my chat is off to the left here. Okay, so let's get started. Let's see here. Oh no, the screens are backwards. Oh no, oh no. All right, so what screen am I sharing with you guys? I'm sharing the second screen. I think I need to share my first.
We can just see your normal presentation.
I'm sorry. Hang on, sorry. I'm gonna share my one screen and maybe it'll reverse it. Because if I share it to this.
It was correct before, Dr. Huynh. So when you had just the humble and healthy, we couldn't see your presenter slide. We could just see the presentation itself.
Okay. Okay, hang on, sorry. I'm just worried that if I put the wrong slides on the left, then I'm going to be staring off screen the whole time, and I don't want to do that. So let me see if I can change that. Sorry. Okay, slides are good. What are you guys seeing? Oh, you guys are still seeing that. That's fine. We'll do that. We'll just run with it. It's fine. Everything's fine. Things are good. All right. So let's see here. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is humility and health, particularly some of the research that is done here at A&M San Antonio with my colleagues and with students here. So I'll present some past work and also talk about some current work that I'm conducting, and then I'll also use the oh boy, let's see. Oh man, now I'm confused. Are you guys seeing the full presentation?
The first version that you had it on, we saw what I think you intended for us to see. Now we're seeing the PowerPoint not in presentation mode.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you for the feedback. Okay, I think I'll just go back and share my screen the other way. I think set up for dual screen. Okay, all right. Sorry about that. Okay, so now you're seeing the presentation. Everything's cool, groovy.
Groovy.
All right. All right. So, anyways, yeah. So I'm going to share some current work that we're doing, and hopefully you guys will take this opportunity to ask some questions, particularly about how you can do research at A&M San Antonio. I think that's really important, and that's kind of my goal here, because most of our attendees are students. So kind of want to talk about the process of research and how you can get involved. So part of it will sort of feel like a self-promoting and recruitment, and maybe it should feel that way. Anyways, okay. So when we talk about humility, what is humility? If you look at the literature, there's quite the mixed review, particularly with earlier work on humility. If you look at the historical roots in philosophy, so Aristotle, for example, thought that humility is a defective state belonging to women, children, slaves, right? This is how historical we're going, that those folks are placed in the same category. And early research in psychology kind of supported some of those positions, that we found that humility was related to incompetence, vulnerability, low self-esteem. However, I think a lot of that was due to really weak measurement instruments. And so recently, probably starting around 2000 with a really seminal paper documenting what humility is and psychology's position on humility, the research on humility has really thrived. So more recent work has found that humility is sort of a great virtue in that it is related to things like gratitude, forgiveness. So traits and outcomes that are I don't know, helpful, conducive to your personal health, your pro-social behaviors, and your relationships. Right? So when we talk about humility, this is usually the definition that social and personality psychologists will use, although there's some variability. Typically, when we talk about humility or whether or not someone is humble, we talk about interpersonal qualities and then interpersonal. So intra is kind of how you view yourself, and then interpersonal is how you connect with other people. So in terms of intrapersonal, humble people tend to have a secure, accepting identity. So they kind of know who they are, right? They know their strengths, their weaknesses. They're not threatened by their weaknesses. They're not threatened by, or they sort of don't oversell their strengths. And that kind of leads into number 2, which is freedom from distortion. They have a pretty good idea of who they are, right? That it's not too grandiose, but it's also, not self-deprecating. Also, humble people tend to be open to new information, particularly when it's information that counters what they already believe. So more details on that in a little bit. This last detail about openness to new information is a hallmark of intellectual humility, and we'll talk about that more. Okay. So that's the intrapersonal component. The interpersonal is how you treat other people. So humble people tend to be other focused. That means they tend to pay attention to other people besides themselves. They tend to value other people's contributions, even when they occupy lower status. And that kind of leads into the egalitarian beliefs, right? That they try to find ways to value others and to place other people on sort of an even playing field. They tend to not believe that they are deserving of any type of special treatment, right? Even if they've contributed, above other people. So, anyways, so when you ask about humility, those two are sort of critical in defining humility: how you see yourself and how you see others, and how you treat others. By the way, I'm trying to get into a groove here. This is very weird because I'm just staring at myself. So I'm trying to get in, and I'm pretending like some of you guys are there. Hey, Louise. Hey, Dr. Weatherford, you're back on. That'll help, I think, to have some friendly faces. Hey, Regina, it's good to see you. That's very helpful. Okay. Anyways, okay. So the 5 hallmarks of humility. Oh, hey, Mario, Dr. Baldessari. Hi, Enzo. You're going to learn about humility today, little man. That's what it's about. Okay. All right. Not sure if you can see the baby there. Okay. So I would consider humility one of the main sort of areas of study for me now. Although, sort of a little bit of background on me, I really didn't do anything with humility until the last year of graduate school, right? Before that, I studied more leadership theories, doctor-patient interactions. And so the very first time I was actually brought on to do a project on humility by someone who is more interested in humility. I was more interested in doctor-patient interactions. So as you can see, this is the first paper that I co-authored on humility. I was actually the second author because it was actually this person's main idea of looking at humility in doctor-patient interactions. Right? So what we wanted to do was to see whether or not humility, defined by those 5 hallmarks, are important for doctors in the way that they interact with patients. Because you see in popular media, for example, like Dr. House, right, where patients and other people tend to like value like narcissism almost, right, like sort of overconfidence, kind of this moxie type of physician. So in this paper, we wanted to examine humility and whether or not that would predict patient health outcomes. Here's some methods. So we actually went and we looked at this huge data set that was collected in the mid-90s. It was of 156 doctors or clinicians at 3 different primary care settings. And so this was an incredibly rich data set that had both physician data, so physicians would fill out stuff, fill out a questionnaire after their visit. Patients would fill out a questionnaire, and also the audio recordings were, or there were audio recordings of the doctor-patient interactions. So the way that we approached studying humility was that we were really concerned about self-report issues of humility. Like if someone came and told you that they're really humble, right? You know, that could be problematic. So it's kind of paradoxical. Right? Maybe humble people aren't willing to admit that they're humble, whereas people who aren't humble will say that they're humble. So what we wanted to do was to listen in on these recorded interactions of doctor and patients, and then have a third sort of a neutral party rate these interactions on physician humility. So there were 156 clinicians, over 2,000 interactions, but we wanted to kind of cut that down a little bit to make sure that we can actually get the project done. Part of this was actually my dissertation data. So we selected 300 doctors and 3 patients per doctor. So this is kind of the structure of the data. So we have a doctor and then 3 patients. So we selected patients based on their SES to the lowest, median, and highest SES for each patient. And then each interaction with the doctor was coded by 4 different raters for inter-rater reliability. So you can kind of tell the structure of the data here. You have data that's happening at the rater level, and then the patient level, and then the physician level, right? So there's some nesting involved. That each thing is nested under a different level. So we had the coders rate the physician's humility. So we trained them on what it means to be humble. We gave them the definition of humility. And then we practiced a couple of these interactions or a couple of audio recordings together. And we said, okay, so how would you rate this doctor from 1 to 7? 7 being really humble, 1 not humble at all. And then we did that a few times, not to make sure that everyone had the same rating, but the same understanding of what it meant to be humble. And then we also had coders rated the physician communication, so their level of empathy, their ability to connect with the patient as a person. So we had the rater data, and then we also had data from the patients. So patients also provided their overall evaluation of their health, what we're calling health status or subjective health status. Okay. I don't want to get into how the data was analyzed because of the nesting issues, but essentially what we found is that physician humility that was rated by these neutral observers was correlated with raters' ratings of communication, but also with patients' rating of health status. So in this initial sort of examination, we provided some evidence to show that, hey, physician humility is correlated with patient outcomes. So with their subjective health, but also with the physician's ability to communicate with patients. And keep in mind that this is our very first look at physician humility directly in the literature. Okay? And we decided to take kind of this third person perspective. So although that approach avoided the sort of like the subjective nature of humility ratings, we wanted to know physician humility from the patient's perspective, right? So it's kind of nice to know what a third person who's listening to the recording says, whether or not this this physician was humble. We thought that it was even more important to see whether or not patients rated this doctor as humble, right? Because ultimately, that's what matters, is how the way that the physician makes that patient feels. Right? Wow, Enzo is so focused. That's way better than any of my students. No offense to students from my classes. Anyways, so in study 2, what we wanted to do was to look at patients' ratings of physician humility and correlate that to patient health outcomes. Sorry, Reagan. Okay, so this paper we actually published with Dr. Bowman here, who's also a professor in the psychology department. So let's kind of show you what we did. So we conducted 2 studies. They're essentially the same study with 2 different samples. So the first sample was with undergraduate students here at A&M San Antonio, a smaller sample. And then we attempted to replicate those findings with an MTurk sample, participants recruited online. You can see the demographics there. What we asked people to do was to rate the most recent doctor's visits. Okay. So, you know, it's not necessarily their regular doctor, it's just the last time that they went to the doctor. We asked them to rate that interaction. So we asked them to rate their doctor's humility using this relational humility scale. We asked them how satisfied they were with the visit, how trusting they were of that physician, and their subjective health, how healthy they were. We also asked them other questions about their demographics. So ethnicity, SES, education. We also asked questions about the clinician. So what was your title? Was it physician? Was it physician's assistant? What's the other one? The nurse practitioner. Right? And then we also asked qualities about the visit, like how long was the wait? Was it easy getting an appointment? What was the staff like? So all these other factors, essentially, we wanted to control in order to uniquely identify physicians' humility in terms of its consequence with patient outcomes. Right? So here are the results. Well, we use hierarchical regression, multiple regression. So essentially, we allowed all the other factors to predict as much of the variance in satisfaction, trust, and health status as possible. And then we said, hey, after all of those factors have been accounted for, what is the unique factor of physician humility in its ability to predict these patient outcomes? So even after accounting for all those factors, what we found was that in the undergraduate sample, that physician humility predicted satisfaction, it predicted trust, it also predicted satisfaction and trust in the MTurk sample. What's interesting is that we didn't find in the undergraduate sample that physician humility predicted health status, but in the MTurk sample it did. And that probably was an issue of sample size, as you can recall. The undergraduate sample was a lot smaller, right? So anyways, this is evidence to indicate that physician humility kind of aligns with what we kind of know in the doctor-patient sort of literature, that when you're humble, you tend to value your patients, you tend to engage more in shared decision-making, you tend to ask more open-ended questions and those types of behaviors that are evidence to show that they're more effective in patient care. And so with the study 2, so study 1 looked at the relationship between physician humility from this third person perspective, right? Study 2 looked at it from the patient's perspective. And, you know, we find sort of supportive evidence for the fact that physician humility matters. However, the first 2 studies both use sort of a very correlational approach to it. And it used retrospective recall, so remembering your last doctor's visit. So in this study, what we wanted to do was take an experimental approach to looking at the potential consequence of physician humility. So this paper was actually conducted with 3 undergraduate students here, Maya, Alicia, and Evelyn. This study was actually funded by Maya's grant that she got through PsyChi. So we got together as a group, we wrote this grant, and we went and conducted this project. And I think all 3 of them I met in my research methods class, and they later joined my class as research assistants. So we wanted to experimentally sort of look at whether physician humility matters. So we decided to look at this through online physician reviews. So what we did was we created a bunch of variations of a potential physician review online. I think we sort of like a Yelp review, right? Except the website we used was Vitos. So we manipulated humility, whether or not the physician will be rated high or low in humility, effectiveness, so whether generally they're a good doctor or not, the gender of the doctor, male or female, and then their specialty, family practice or orthopedic. This last factor, we were curious to know if physician humility would be valued more in sort of a more patient-centered type of care in family practice, whereas orthopedic is considered, I guess, more technical. So we wanted to know whether or not that would matter for physician humility. Okay. So here's a sample review. So gender was manipulated by this Edward versus Emily, right? So in the female version, it was Emily. So here's family medicine. The other one would be orthopedic surgery. This is competency. Right? So overall, this doctor was rated 2.3. The other one, I think we put at 4.7. So like this is overall a pretty bad doctor, and the other one's overall pretty good. And then for the humility, here we said Dr. Johnson is very humble in his approach to patient care. And the other version we said is not humble in his approach to patient care. Okay, so we manipulated humility, gender, specialty, and overall competence. Okay. I'm going to present, so some measures. We asked them how likely they were going to select that doctor for themselves, also recommend that doctor to family and friends. If they went and saw that doctor, how likely they were to adhere to their recommendations, how much they would trust that doctor, and their satisfaction. We also asked, hey, how much are you willing to pay out of pocket to see this person, right? From 0, none at all, to 100, a great deal of money, right? So I should say that across the board, more humble doctors were rated higher than non-humble doctors for all of those outcomes. Okay, so for likelihood to recommend, adherence, trust, satisfaction, money. So across the board, humble doctors scored better, but that's probably not terribly interesting. Right? What's interesting is the interaction between those variables. So here's a graph that presents data that looks at a specialty, right? So does specialty matter when you're looking at physician humility? So here are 2 outcomes: anticipated satisfaction to how satisfied they are likely to be, and then out-of-pocket spending. So you'll see that the solid line is the high humility condition. Okay? So that's what I kind of meant here, is that if you're humble across the board, you tend to receive higher ratings. But it seems like that humility, high humility matters more in family medicine than it does for a technical field like orthopedic surgery. Same thing here with out-of-pocket spending, right? And if you look at this, yes, high humility is better than low humility, but it seems like high humility really matters in family medicine compared to family medicine. And so these 2 points aren't significantly different, whereas these two are. We also look at the other outcomes, and this is for humility and effectiveness. Right? So think about the overall ratings of 2.3 versus 4.7, I think it was. So again, high humility is rated better, but what's interesting here is that if you're high, if you're a good doctor to begin with, it doesn't seem to matter as much whether or not you're humble. Right? What seems to matter more is that if you are a bad doctor, right, humility tends to matter a bit more. So it almost seems like if overall you have low ratings or you're perceived to be a bad doctor, that being humble can sort of buffer against some of that in terms of patients' trust, their willingness to listen to your recommendations, and their overall satisfaction. So study 3 demonstrated that physician humility is important not only for past interactions, but it has a potential to influence future interactions. Right? So going into a visit, if you have expectations about whether or not your physician is humble or not, that may influence your behavior and ultimately influence your outcome based on this expectation, this confirmation expectation confirmation framework, right? Or the self-fulfilling prophecy is another term that you may have come across. So in these 3 studies, we overall, we demonstrate that physician humility is important. It's important for patients' health, satisfaction, and trust. It's also important for the doctors, right? Like it seems like if you look at out-of-pocket spending, patients are willing to pay more for humble doctors compared to non-humble doctors. And we demonstrate the importance of physician humility through a range of evidence from, neutral observers, neutral third-party observers, to patient ratings, to also experimental evidence looking into the potential influence of physician humility. Okay, so that's humility as it relates to doctor-patient interaction. But what about personal humility? Does being humble for you as a person affect your health? Okay. So when we asked this question, we had a student who joined the lab who wanted to answer this question in a very specific way. She said, well, if you're humble, it sounds to me like you're willing to be more flexible in your knowledge base. Right? So when we talk about humility as it relates to your knowledge, right, the concept here is intellectual humility. So when people are intellectually humble, their ego and their intellect are detached. Right? They don't commit their ego to knowledge. They understand that knowledge is flexible and is dynamic. And so they're open to revising their viewpoints. They respect other people's viewpoints even when it disagrees with their own, and they lack overconfidence. So they're not cocky about what they know. Okay. So Amy, who was an undergraduate here, who's currently a graduate student at Sam Houston, who just got acceptance into a PhD program for clinical psychology at University of Houston, she said, hey, what if we looked at intellectual humility and vaccine attitudes and intentions? So we recruited participants from Amazon Mechanical Turk. She also submitted a Psychi grant and received funding to conduct the study. So you can see the demographics here. You can see a trend that usually when students come in and they're Psych students, we plan a project together, and then I ask them to write a Psych grant on the project, mostly because I want to see their understanding of what the project will look like. Because sometimes we go back and forth and I have an idea of what the project will look like. They have an idea of what the project will look like, but then we don't match. So by having them write this grant, they're able to fully kind of actualize what the project is. And then we have a much clearer understanding how to move forward. And then they can also take ownership of the study. So anyways, we looked at intellectual humility, which is measured by this intellectual humility scale that has 4 subscales. And then we looked at anti-vaccination attitudes. And so these attitudes, as you can imagine, are quite relevant today. If you think about popular reasons why people don't vaccinate, it comes down to these 4. These tend to be the most 4 popular ones. So mistrust of vaccine benefit. They don't think that it's effective in keeping you from getting the disease that you're trying to prevent it from getting, right? 2, worries about side effects. Okay? 3, worries about pharmaceutical companies making money. Okay? And then the last one is preference for natural immunity. They think that, you know, you'll hear something that's like, hey, I work out, I eat healthy, like that's my vaccine, right? Whatever, bro. So anyways, we wanted to look at the relationship between intellectual humility and anti-vaccination attitudes. And then Amy also wanted to look at intentions to vaccinate against the flu. And so this research was done prior to COVID-19. Right? So we wanted to see whether or not these anti-vaccination attitudes and intellectual humility would predict whether or not you got the flu shot. So overall, what we found is that intellectual humility is correlated with anti-vaccination attitudes. So the higher intellectual humility, the lower anti-vaccination attitudes. It seems like it was driven mostly by openness to revising one's viewpoint and a lack of intellectual overconfidence. Interestingly, we actually found that intellectual humility did not predict one's intention to get the flu shot. I think it was probably because of the time of year we conducted the study. Recently, though, so as you can tell, this first study, Amy was the lead author here because it was her idea, and she really kind of took the reins. And then once we published that paper and COVID hit, I said, hey, Amy, you had a great idea. How about we circle back and look at that same study, but now we look at intentions to vaccinate against COVID-19 instead of the flu. So we went back and this study was just published, but we replicated those findings. We found that intellectual humility predicted anti-vaccination attitudes, negative correlation. And in this study, we even went further. We controlled for a bunch of factors. So we didn't just present the correlation. Again, we use hierarchical regression. We controlled for SES, education, other demographic factors. And sure enough, we still found that intellectual humility uniquely predicted anti-vaccination attitudes above and beyond the other factors. Okay, so, and it predicted intentions to vaccinate against COVID-19, right? Whereas the other study found no relationship to intentions to vaccinate against the flu, we found that intellectual humility did predict intentions to vaccinate against COVID-19. I think this is kind of key though, right? Because information about COVID-19 has been relatively fluid. Right. And even in terms of its vaccine rollout, its vaccine effectiveness. For example, today, there's news coming out about the need to pause the distribution of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because of concerns over blood clots. It's like, I think it was like 6 women and 7 million people who have received the shot. Not to downplay those concerns, but it's fluid, right? And so I think it's really important to be flexible in your knowledge regarding concerns. Right now, we have some other works ongoing. I have a paper with Dr. Bayless, who's in public health, looking at intellectual humility and mask use. And I think this is kind of similar, right? The information and rollout about masks or face covering has been relatively fluid. At first, they came out and said, hey, if you're sick, wear it. If you're not sick, you don't have to wear it. And now, they progressed to saying like everyone should wear it. And then they progressed to saying 2 masks is better than 1. And then, so intellectual humility would allow you to kind of upgrade your knowledge base with the growing evidence. Whereas, if you're lower on intellectual humility, you might say things like, they don't know what they're talking about, right? They're constantly changing their minds, and this knowledge is unreliable. Other ongoing projects, I have a paper looking at intellectual humility and how it can mitigate the relationship between political orientation and anti-vaccination attitudes. It's weird, but it's probably not surprising that one of the biggest factors right now in predicting who's going to get vaccinated or not is their political orientation, right? More conservative, less likely to take the COVID-19 vaccine. So intellectual humility might be able to sort of to interfere with that relationship. Right now, Dr. Bowman and Caitlin Nelson and I have a paper looking at patients' definition of humility. The paper is under review. She's interested in attending medical school. And then Lizette, who's a former RA, and I looked at anti-vaccination attitudes and celebrity worship, right? Which is different than humility, but I kind of want to show you guys how these research ideas develop. Right? I wasn't really doing humility, but then I got dragged onto a project because I was interested in doctor-patient relationships. And now I do a lot of humility research. And then Caitlin kind of dragged me into this idea of anti-vaccination attitudes. And then Lizette took anti-vaccination attitudes, and she's interested in attitudes and celebrities. And so she went and dragged me into that paper. I'm very thankful that I get dragged around. But I'm just saying, like, you kind of see what we do, and we're not necessarily interested in you coming in and doing the exact same thing as we're doing. We're interested in your thoughts and your ideas and how you can take us in different directions. Anyways, and hopefully the process becomes sort of transformative, right? That, like Lizette is pursuing a PhD at UConn in sort of health attitudes, looking at, the influence of celebrities. So something that she started here, she's doing, at the next level, and she's going to come out and, I don't know, be a professor, be a researcher, and all that stuff based on, the ideas that she had while she was here at A&M taking classes and doing research here. Okay, so ongoing works, boom, your ideas. What do you have, right? What things do you have in mind? I see Stephanie threw in an idea there. Sorry, maybe let me finish the presentation, and then I will go back and address that. That seems like a really interesting question, right? So if you have ideas, come throw them at me, right? And we'll see what we can do. So overall, kind of takeaway conclusions. So humility is defined by both its how you see yourself, and interpersonal components, how you treat other people, how you see other people. It's important for relationships with power imbalance and doctor-patient relationships particularly. And it may have implications for your physical health. And so far, we've looked at it via anti-vaccination attitudes. Okay. If humility is important, what are some strategies to cultivate it? What are some ways to become more humble? So the research has shown that, hey, if you keep this definition in mind, that humility is about how you see yourself, being secure in your identity, knowing that you have strengths, you have weaknesses, but also it's about how you treat other people. It's about trying to put others first. It's about trying to see other people's contributions, their value, particularly when they occupy lower status, right? That's one critical way to being more humble. Beyond that, what we see is that when you have opportunities to express gratitude, you tend to be more humble. So in studies, participants will write letters of gratitude to people who they want to say thanks to. You don't necessarily have to send the letter, but there are increases in gratitude that way. And gratitude and humility kind of play on each other. You know, if you increase gratitude, you tend to increase humility. And once you increase humility, you tend to increase your level of gratitude. Another way is to find awe-inspiring experiences, right? Get out into nature, be reminded that you are a tiny speck in the vastness of the world, right? So I think research on this is really interesting because they take people out into nature, they let them do VR, virtual reality, where they're like going out in space, so that they're just kind of reminded about, you know, their self compared to the vastness of the world. Another strategy is to practice mindfulness, getting an understanding of what it's like to be in the present moment, you know, seeing negative thoughts, you know, as floating and fleeting is one strategy. And one strategy that I'm currently working on is looking at impermanence as in relation to humility. So a lot of the literature looks at humility in terms of the size of your ego. So making sure your ego is not too big, not too small. One approach I'm looking at is thinking about your ego not in terms of size, but in terms of time, right? That I think people who are humble tend to see themselves as fleeting, right? That they don't think their contribution is that important because it's not going to be there forever. I think probably humble people, for example, see themselves as in time as maybe being ahead, but not necessarily better. So, for example, in one of my approaches to mentoring is that I see you as me, but just a few years behind, right? That I'm, you know, that I'm not necessarily better in my students in any particular way. It's just that I happen to have done it first. I'm just a few years older, probably more than a few years, probably quite a few years older. And so anyways, I'm looking at the relationship between time and humility. All right, so that's it for me. Thank you for joining. Here's a website to my lab. If you're interested in joining us and doing some research, if you're interested in doing research, you can also email me directly, and I would be happy to kind of entertain those ideas. Okay. Thanks, Simone, for the you too, Katia. All right, so let's open it up for questions. Actually, before we do that, Dr. Weatherford reminds you that make sure that your login name corresponds to your name on Sona in order to earn credit for this experience. I like that you call it this experience. All right, so let's see here. I'm going to read off some questions. Steph Gooding says, on humility intelligence, on both my aunt, who is a seasoned RN, and a doctor I listened to on a podcast were both anti-vaccination, even though they had access to current research long before I did regarding the mRNA research with vaccines. Yeah, so that's interesting because, as you can tell, vaccinations are really complex, right? Health psychologists would ask you to take like this kind of biopsychosocial approach to predicting your behavior. Certainly, like, they have access to the information, but do they want that information? Or are they seeking other information, right? And I don't know, there are probably a host of other factors besides just being in the medical profession that predicts whether or not they get the vaccine.
No, they definitely both. It's one of the reasons why I was listening to this specific podcast. And I want to say that she was like supposedly a virologist or something. And then my aunt she is definitely into research and finding all kinds of different stuff. She works with like infants on the NICU. But now they both had a lot of access to a lot more stuff than I did, and it was just funny because my aunt was like, "No, don't get the vaccine. Don't get it. Don't get it. You don't know." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, I got it anyway." But I feel like because of their profession, and a lot of times doctors are like, "Oh, well, I'm the one with the degree. I'm the one with, I'm the doctor. I know better than you," kind of attitude. Um, because they are so smart and into the scene and hands on, I feel like that's kind of why, um, you know, that word, just the humility, there was none. It's like, no, I know better. But now my aunt is vaccinated, and I'm pretty sure this doctor is too because I checked back. But it's just funny because sometimes people who are in this profession, especially, I've dealt with some other stuff with a doctor with one of my mom's doctors before she passed, and it was kind of the same thing, no humility, very much into himself, very much, so much to the point that it was a detriment to my mom, and didn't even change after like actions were taken. So I totally
Right.
get this whole lecture.
Right. So really, really interesting ideas there. And I think when you're looking at, and this is why if you're a psych major, right, we ask you not to listen to people just because they're perceived expert in something, right? We ask you to like look at the evidence, because it's like if you're a psychologist, I'm sure there are psychologists out there who tell you not to go to therapy, right, or who don't believe in therapy for themselves, right? So it doesn't necessarily as psych majors or people with advanced degrees, or you should know to evaluate the evidence for itself and not rely on one or two people to tell you what to do. So let me go on to the next question here. Wouldn't humility be even more important for a practicing psychologist, more so than the family protective? Hey, now here's an idea we can do a project together on, right? We can look at physician humility for mental health providers. We actually have a project written up about cultural humility, but not anything about global humility. I haven't seen anything in the literature on that, so that could be an interesting project to pursue, Thomas. Mario, Dr. Baldessari says, what do you do to cultivate your humility? I'm terrible at being humble, so I'm reminded of this when I do these lectures, to I don't know, to be humble. But I think probably the biggest factor is that interpersonal component. Like I try, and I'm terrible at it, but find value in other people, right? And know that they have something to contribute to the conversation, regardless of who they are. Thanks for that lob there, Mario. Appreciate that. Can the bystander effect be affected by intellectual humility? What do you mean by that, Simone?
I'm Simone. But anyway, in in your research, you showed how intellectual humility was like, I don't know, like it affected certain like situations. So I thought, and like how within people it was like very important. So I thought about like how in certain situations when we learn about the bystander effect and how people may see someone like getting hurt, but like there's not a lot of people there, would they like go help them, depending on like how many people are there, or like just I guess their decision to go and help somebody, and like the bystander effect does intellectual humility, like does their intellectual humility like affect that?
That's a great question. So the short answer is I don't know. I would say that because especially when you're talking about intellectual humility, so intellectual humility is much more about knowledge. And I think if you were to ask me that question about general humility, I would say probably yes, that there's a ton of evidence to demonstrate that that humble people tend to be more helpful, generally. They tend to be sort of better citizens of the world. So I would imagine that if you're hurt and you're in a crowd, in the bystander effect, that perhaps more humble people will kind of break out of that bystander effect. But I don't know. I don't know. That's a great question. Reagan says, humility creeps into every aspect of life. It seems like humility would influence respect for others. I wonder how important it is when it comes to respect. I would say, yes, you're right. It's very important. I think that's one of the core aspects of humility, particularly as it comes to other people's contributions, but also other people's ideas, respecting their ideas, even when they're separate from yours or when they're different than yours. Okay, so I agree. Okay, I think that was a humble person would say, I agree. Okay, that's not very helpful. All right, RE Stephanie's point, a friend's MD's programs have suggested to me that med school pushes humility out of you. That's interesting, right? That the idea that that the training in medical school pushes pushes humility out of you. I think there are a lot of forces that are trying to push it back into them, right? That there's just overwhelming evidence to demonstrate that effective doctors are not just knowledgeable, competent medical providers. There's so much that is at stake for the interaction itself and how you treat your patients, how you communicate with them, your position, your type of questioning. I think there's so much. Right? I think I once had a class where a student goes, "I don't believe in any of this stuff, right? We're just machines. You put oil in me, and I run." I just like couldn't disagree more, like because I'm like, if I just feed my wife, she's not just going to be happy. Like I have to tell her I love her. I have to do other stuff to show that I care and respect her. Just, I imagine that's how caring for your patients is. You can't just go say, take this medicine and it works, right? You have to show care. You have to, I don't know, provide other things besides just clean, clear, competent medical care. Anyways, let me see here, Mario. There are different motivations. Okay, sure. That's it. That's a great response there, Dr. Lilly. I think someone raised their hand maybe. Is that true?
It was me, Steph Gooding. I just wanted to say thank you both to Dr. Baldessari and Lily. Yeah, one of the doctors that my mom had, I feel like he'd been practicing for a long time and getting these couple of different perspectives. I never would have thought about med school, kind of pushing that out of you. I mean, I guess as a physician, at some point, especially if you do surgery, you kind of have to, I would feel like you have to separate, like at one point you have to compartmentalize and do what you need to do and all of that. And yeah, and with the different motivations, I definitely think this gentleman's motivation by the time he met my mom, I have no clue what his stuff was before, but by the time he met my mom, I think it was more financially motivated at that point. But that's just my, opinion. But yeah, treating how you treat. My mom had a lot of back issues and pain issues, and it was very hard on her, and mentally and physically. And finally, I had to convince her just to get rid of this doctor that she had had for, probably 15 years. And when she did and switched to a different doctor who through the things you were talking about, Dr. Huynh, chose a doctor who was more personable, was more, we did a lot of research because my mom was super scared to leave this one doctor. And when we did, her mental health improved, at least by 50%. I mean, it was amazing. But I never thought about how they're taught in med school and stuff like that. So thank you, Dr. Baldessari, for that insight on that. Makes me feel a little better.
Thanks, and thanks for your thoughts there, Steph. Okay, so this next question here: do you think humility is pushed out of a person during medical school, depending on their career? My grandfather was a surgeon and was a wonderful person, but around his patients, he was more professional. But I would also say cold his nurses were terrified of him. So this is interesting, right? We're taking this idea that medical school is pushing humility out, and we're running with it. So first of all, let's back up and say that we don't have any evidence for that claim, right? Not yet. So if you're interested in studying that, would love to study that on a formal basis, but I think just based on one or two data points to say that medical school pushes humility out of you, I think might be presumptuous at this point, right? I think too, right, that when we think of humility, I think sometimes we think about it as being timid, right? But if we go back, timid is not part of the definition. It's about knowing yourself. It's about knowing your strengths and your weaknesses, right? So I think that leads into Thomas's question here. Can humility lead into indecisiveness? I think it can lead to probably slower decisions, right? Decisions where you want to involve other people. And depending on your cultural stance, you might not like that. So like Americans love it when leaders go with the guts, right? Like, make me a gut decision, not make me an informed decision, right? And so we see that in how we value leaders. Sometimes we like people who just go with whatever, whereas other leaders will think and get experts' opinions and things like that, and that's not valued as highly. So I guess it can lead to indecisiveness, although this indecisiveness may lead to better decision making, right? I guess it depends on how you define indecisiveness. I will go one more, and then I think it's time. Academia in general kind of makes people jaded from observation of students on social media sites. So I wonder if not adopting humility is a defense mechanism to keep oneself. Sure. I think it's hard work. Being humble. It is. It's hard work, right? Just having to look at yourself and saying like, hey, these are the things I'm good at. These are the things I'm working on or I'm not quite good at. I think even that process can kind of beat you down, right? Oh my, all right, now we're getting emails about an excuse no-shows and all that stuff. So we're gonna have to, well, we'll address that later. Well, Dylan, why don't you shoot me an email or CC Dr. Weatherford and we'll figure that out, okay? All right, again, I appreciate everyone who came and listened and participated. Please reach out to me if there's anything I can do. Certainly, research is one avenue to potentially transform your experience here at A&M San Antonio, right? And kind of get you into the next step of where you want to go. It's not the only way, but it certainly is a viable option. Okay. All right, everyone. Have a pleasant day. Bye, Louise. Thanks for turning on your mic, Regina, your camera, Louise. Simone, appreciate that. You too, Dr. Weatherford. Bye, Thomas. We're late than never. I love it. Thank you.